So I'm here, humbly here with this panel in front of me, who are all founding members of the Ethical AI Governance Group, in addition to having some pretty impressive day jobs as well. So I thought maybe you could each introduce yourselves just in terms of your day job quickly, and then we'll just dive into some of the content you've been releasing and some of the topics that we want to talk about today. So Tobias?
Head up generative AI for Walmart. That's my day job. And then I'm chairman of the board of advisors here at EAIGG.
Right. I'm Manik Bose. I'm managing partner at BGV, early stage VC firm investing in AI since 2016, and also one of the founders of EIGG.
I am Olivia Gamblin. I am an AI ethicist, and my book, Responsible AI, Implement an Ethical Approach in Your Organization, was just released last month, and I'm on the, thank you, subtle plug, but I'm on the board of advisors for EAIGG.
Anik, maybe you could kick us off with some content from the white paper. You know, we heard from Salim this morning. It's very difficult to predict the future, obviously, looking out 5 years. But you know, you've done some scenario planning around that. So I thought maybe just to ground the conversation, talk a little bit about some of the scenarios you see emerging over time.
Right. So yeah, thanks, Kevin. So we looked at 4 broad scenarios, and we basically, what we did is we have a steering committee that's comprised of about 20 folks. They come from big tech, they're founders, they're responsible AI folks, they're folks who are entrepreneurs as well as kind of policymakers. And we've kind of looked very broadly at what are the kind of scenarios of AI that are likely to evolve. And we fundamentally felt there were 4 broad potential scenarios that could evolve. And these are not mutually exclusive. Some of these attributes may cross over. The first one is what we call the AI quantum leap, which is basically big tech driven. And I think it's where we are today. There's a lot of innovation happening in the infrastructure layer. And when you look at that model, what's interesting about that is it's literally a technology out type of a scenario. The second scenario we felt was something we described as a Magna Carta, which was a rights-driven approach, where fundamentally, you know, each of the countries would come up with their own AI regulation, there would be harmonization, you would have more of a global kind of policy. We believe that's very low likelihood because of a lot of the comments that were made earlier. Every country is moving forward with what they're trying to do. EU has their own EU Act, you know, there's the Biden order. All these things are happening differently. The third scenario we looked at was what we call the AI Da Vinci error. And what that was basically described as was to fuse intelligent machines, which is AI-driven agents, with humans in collaboration to drive greater productivity. And this is a scenario in which there's collaboration, there's innovation coming from large tech companies, but also a lot of application innovation coming from startups. The last scenario is what we call the AI class struggle. And I think somebody mentioned earlier in a session about AI sovereignty. This is where, you know, it's a dystopian scenario, like the Hollywood bad ending, where every country treats AI as a nuclear weapon. They race ahead to kind of build the biggest stockpile they can build. And what ends up happening is there's very low trust in AI, and there's a big class of haves and have-nots. And as we looked at these 4 scenarios, we tried to kind of gauge what was the most likely scenario. And we looked at a couple of things we call critical uncertainties. The first one we looked at was computational power. The second one we looked at was model capacity. And the third we looked at was basically, you know, algorithmic advances. These are all what I would call technology factors. Then we looked at what I would call data-centric factors: data integration, data quality, human in the loop, regulation, so on and so forth. What we felt was that the first 3 technology factors were overweight, which is whether it's computational power, whether it's kind of, you know, what we call model algorithmic advances. These were way ahead of the other 4 factors around data quality, around human expertise in the loop, regulation, ethics, data integration, AI adoption focus. And we felt that because of this, that where we're headed today is more towards scenario 1. That's what we felt as a group. And the second thing we felt also was the fact that if we want to basically morph it in a different direction, the democratization of AI becomes really, really important. And that's where we felt that fundamentally addressing these underweight factors on data quality, around human expertise, data integration, you know, more kind of, you know, agent applications. This is where innovation needs to come from startups to kind of move us in that direction.
No, I think it's a great grounding, and to talk about the fact that it's a deliberate choice on which of some of those scenarios we want to influence over time. And I think you mentioned it before, they're not mutually exclusive. You know, we will see around the world different influences that may we may exist in all four scenarios at the same time. Tobias, talk a little bit about your role in the retail industry, right? So you have to think about the strategic implications of those scenarios emerging at different paces. How does that influence what you're driving? How do you start to also think about how you can influence it in your position and as an industry at large start to move in a more positive direction over time?
Yeah, big question. So we looked at it from the perspective of what is the AI strategy, the Gen AI strategy. How does it map into our corporate strategy? And then what's happening within the digital transformation or business transformation that's also going on in parallel? And when you actually put all of those things together, you can put it in a little bit of a kind of a matrix. And so what we did is we said, okay, are there things that we need to do from an RPA process and a BPA process? And so when we're going through this transformation, one of the things that we looked at more specifically was, what is the workflow for really mundane tasks? Can they be automated? Which ones can be potentially automated? Are they critical? Do they require a high degree of accuracy? And then from the BPA side, when we're actually doing entire processes, what do you actually look for there? Can you actually use AI to completely redefine the existing process from an operational perspective, and then supplement it potentially with some back-end integration and view the enterprise a little bit more holistically so that you can better and more effectively manage it?
No, Olivia, talk a little bit about the tension the leaders in that scenario might face that Tobias described it as a really deliberate choice, which is, I'm sure, exactly how it plays out. But there's different tensions that they feel when they think about the diversity of cultures, et cetera. Talk a little bit about, in your research, some of the things you've seen leaders have to contend with.
Absolutely, and I think a theme that I've been listening to throughout today is it feels like AI is everywhere, everything, all at once. I think I messed up that movie title. But it's coming from all different directions. And so what leaders are having to face is not only I need to keep up on technical advances, I need to keep up on the political atmosphere. I need to keep up on the cultural sensitivities. There's all of these different factors that leaders are having to deal with on this a bit of an odd dichotomy. On one end of the spectrum, we've got people and leaders and teams that are saying, well, AI is the best thing ever. It's like a magic wand. We can plug and play, it'll solve all of our problems, and everything will be hunky-dory. Then we have the opposite end of that dichotomy, the opposite end of that spectrum of this fear of AI is taking our jobs, it's taking over. In a leadership position, you're looking at all of the sometimes unnecessary risk that you're introducing into the business by taking on these tools. So how, as a leader, are you supposed to navigate diversity of cultures, diversity of political spheres, the different approaches and developments in technology, while also navigating both ends of these spectrums of keeping the enthusiasts in check and keeping the more risk-averse a little more open to some change?
And let me just jump in real quick. The organizational strategy, I think, is so important. One of the things that we look at the steering committee level is what is our relationship with 2.2 million people who work at Walmart. We're the largest company, obviously, in the world in terms of the number of people who work there. And how does our decision with augmentation and automation impact our social contract with these different segments of our workers? Because not all of them are affected and impacted equally.
No, I think it's a broader question that you look at back, Anik, to your point, the pace of change and what we're in control over, but the second and third and fourth order effects of this, I think we have barely scratched the surface of some of those questions. Anik, I'm going to put you on the spot for a second because we didn't actually prep this question, but how do you view it as from the investor's perspective? How do you think through those scenarios, and how does it start to shape and influence some of the startups that you may be backing?
Yeah, so I think, Kevin, as you look at that, we fundamentally believe that what's really happening right now is massive investments in AI infrastructure that'll basically, very similar to what happened with the internet infrastructure, out of which came all the application startups. You wouldn't have mobile applications, you wouldn't have SaaS applications, you wouldn't have e-commerce applications, you wouldn't have Zoom if you didn't have the internet. And I believe the same thing's going to happen with startups. So when we look at startups, for a fund like us, we look at startups that are going to be playing at the application layer, not necessarily at the infrastructure layer. And we believe there'll be startups that are trying to solve different problems that are there today. The first problem is the fact that these startups in the enterprise have to focus on applications which require domain-specific data sets. So if you're trying to solve a problem with, in cardiology testing, it's a different data set than trying to scrape the entire internet with large language models and trying to use that for that. It's very different if you're trying to solve remediation of cybersecurity threats in a SOC. So we believe there'll be a lot of innovation, both with small language models and startups that are the application layer, either for enterprise function or for vertical markets. I think I heard earlier about different markets, could be retail, could be healthcare. So we look at those kind of companies in terms of innovation.
And from a technical perspective, Anik and I are in the process of getting the next white paper going, and we really talk about how chained small models can impact the overall footprint, and then how potentially merged models in a hybrid architecture could potentially fulfill the needs of an enterprise if you have a brick and mortar presence, and then what it would look like in order to go to a frontier model. And when you put all three of those pieces of architecture in place, you get lower costs, you get better experiences, quicker inferencing, and potentially much better scale with much better data sets that are actually curated to solve a specific set of use cases and workflow.
So Olivia, I'm going to come back to you for a minute, because when you think about the pace of change and all the different emerging technologies that we're talking about here, the ability to fall behind on the ethics control curve is, probably more threatening right now than it ever has been in the past. Can you spend a little bit of time just describing what you believe are some of the ways that leaders and organizations today should be starting to embed that in their foundational way of thinking of this as they try and keep pace with the technology changes?
Absolutely. So I want to start real quick. How many of you have heard of responsible AI? Okay, how many of you have a plan in place? Hey, this is getting better. This is encouraging for me.
That's pretty good.
When I started and I asked how many of you have ever heard of responsible AI, no one in the room would raise their hand. So this is a big change, which is great to see. But why I asked that and what I really want to focus on here is there are some simple foundational pieces that you can put into place now as you're building out your AI strategies, where responsible AI isn't a tag-on at the very end. It actually needs to be embedded in your entire strategy from the start. And I have 3 ways that you can do this, but I want to answer real quick, actually, why you do it in the first place.
Please.
And Anik, this actually came from your breakfast session earlier when you were talking about Louis Vuitton and how one of their biggest, or what they would say is their biggest asset, is their brand, because customers trust their brand. We're looking at AI right now. There's an extreme mistrust happening in the market around AI. So protecting the brand and protecting the company's values actually translates into being able to not only survive, but thrive in this disruption that we're facing. So how do you do that? I'm going to summarize these real quick. There's 3 easy ways. The first one, what's happening right now when it comes to responsible AI or ethics, like I said, it gets tacked on at the end. It's kind of like an afterthought. Imagine being in, let's say, middle management, or even on an engineering team, going through all of the process of creating an AI product, getting it ready to ship, you're all excited, and then there's some guy sitting there saying, hey, you did it wrong. Go back, fix it. We have to go do all of these checks now, and we have to now change how, down to the fundamentals of how we actually develop this product. That's exhausting. That's a waste of time and resources, and there's so much friction created in those steps. Instead, if you're shifting the conversation of ethics and those values actually into the design phases where you're at the very start, where you're starting with the question of what is the human impact we are looking to achieve here, what values are actually going to drive our either AI adoption or development strategies, you're actually using ethics as a tool for innovation at the very start. Now it becomes a creative driver. Now, instead of reaching the end of a project and getting ready to ship and having to go back and fix things, you are already building that in from the start. So that's the first part, shifting that conversation earlier into the process. The second part, you already heard me start to talk a little bit about there. Ethics and responsible AI can get pigeonholed into compliance and regulation quite often. And you'll hear it talked about as risk. That is very important. I'm not saying that's not important. Please don't go home and say an AI ethicist told you that it's okay to break the law. Now, compliance is very important, But it's not the entire story. Ethics can be used as a tool for innovation. When we're looking at values-based product innovation, when we are using our values that have built these brands, that have built these companies for decades, and bringing those into the conversation for how we're using and adopting and developing AI, that is a creative pursuit. That is an innovation practice. So instead of asking, how can I protect these values? How can we protect for things going wrong? Shifting that question to, how do we align with our company values? How do we align with these cultural values that we see in this brand that we've built up over decades? And the last one, I'm summarizing all of these, I promise. The last one is that AI and responsible AI is not primarily a technical problem to solve. I know that sounds a little scandalous. But when it comes to adoption or development of AI, the biggest levers of change and indicators for success are within the people and process layer. If your people don't know what they're doing and they don't know how to do it, or let's say if your people are unmotivated and have no clue of what direction to go in, they're never going to reach the end of the road, which is the technology. We're never going to reach the tip of the iceberg. Technology is important to get the infrastructure in place, but look at the people and process before you move towards actually embracing the technology.
We have a little saying,
Please.
and that is, it's about the people, and then we pause. It's always about the people.
Exactly.
That simple.
No, I think it's critical, and I think designing that in from the very beginning and having that ethos, on the teams that are working on this, because it is such a fast-moving area, and there are so many technical challenges to overcome. It would be easy to gloss over that domain of it. But the risk and exposure down the road, to your point back to the brand, is enormous. To forget the people involved, to have them disconnect from the adoption. It's actually in the greater economic good to design it from the beginning to ensure there's no hiccup or stall point down the road. We've advised a number of people, look, there's going to be some hiccup to AI.
Absolutely.
Right? Someone bad, it's going to happen, and there's going to be a big stock market fallout for that company or whatever it may be, and there will be a forced pause at that moment where everyone goes back to reevaluate, wait, am I exposed equally? The question is, if I can be in control of that ahead of time and anticipate some of those different scenarios, the likelihood that you can move ahead while everyone else has to take that pause, I think should be the economic driver behind some of these choices. So it's not just about the right thing to do, it's also the right business choice as well. And I know in your work with I'm going to get this right, EAIGG, you've seen a number of different companies approach this and different tacks to it. What are some of the examples you've seen? How are you seeing it evolve? I mean, it's only been roughly 2 years since this all broke, but we've already gone through a couple iterations of this approach. What are some of the things you've seen?
Yeah, so I'll maybe answer that question, Kevin, from the startup perspective as well as established tech companies.
Yep.
So I think on the established tech company front, going back to what Olivia said, responsible AI cannot be an afterthought. To have trust in the AI solution, you have to have some basic guardrails. AI compliance, AI audits. If you're selling that product and you don't have those things done, you're going to have a tough time getting adoption in the enterprise. The third layer, which is kind of completely underestimated today, and all of you have been doing technology deployment, whether it comes from old days of ERP or CRM, change management is a huge aspect that is completely not understood today. As Tobias and Olivia said, it's about the people. So if people don't understand how AI is going to be integrated into their workflows, and they have no involvement, disengagement. Number two, if they're not trained how to use these tools, reskilling is not going to fly. So these are all the things that we're seeing, at least, that are relevant to startups, but also larger enterprises that are trying to deploy AI, that if they don't address these issues, it's not about the technology. It's all about the people and the process. And what's amazing to me is the companies that are really having a lot of traction are the ones that are addressing this, and the people who are having low adoption, the folks who have not addressed this.
Yeah, one of the things that we do in product is we just look at first principles. I'm not going to share them all with you here today. It's kind of some of the secret sauce. But the first one that we have is our end users are not prompt engineers, right? It's not going to happen for a 70-year-old person who's at the front of the store greeting people. Same thing potentially with somebody who's working the checkout aisles, somebody who's picking and stocking the goods in a store. You can't have a command line interface and potentially have somebody typing in the middle of their workflow. Also, one of the things that we've looked at, I think that it's really important, is adaptable. So what does that mean? Well, what if you actually had the capability to have a microphone on that device that you're interacting with, and you knew that the front end of a store was operating at 65 decibels, and that if you responded back to them, like GPT can now, in an audio format, is that person going to get drowned out? Are you going to be able to hear it? Are you going to be able to see it? Right? So it should be a true multimodal experience, and it should be adaptive based on the person, their learning capabilities, the way that they learn, as well as the environment. And I think that we're not quite there yet, but we're not far off.
But I think designing it from that human experience
That's
from
it.
the very
You nailed
beginning
it.
and considering every instance of every role. The complexity of that can be overwhelming, and yet if you don't do it right, the adoption down the road or the implications down the road are going to be huge.
That's right.
We have time for one more question. I'm going to ask all three of you to kind of answer this one. We talked a little bit about this as we were prepping for this session, which is AI is both the cause of some of these debates and challenges, but also AI is a potential solution. So using the technology to solve for the challenges the technology is generating.
Yeah.
Thoughts on how do you use AI to police AI?
So I think that there's one big thing that maybe is not well understood unless you're really into the nuts and bolts from a security perspective. If you add new language capabilities, that's a new attack vector. If you add new algorithms, that's a new attack vector. If you add new capabilities and new features, that's a new attack vector. If you're building applications on top of this, on top of a large language model or a small language model, that's a new attack vector. So all of these really cool things that we're doing, yeah, they're really neat, and they're really potentially cool, and they're really potentially going to deliver a 15, 20, 25% productivity gain in your enterprise. But it potentially can come at a big cost. And so if you look at it from a DevSecOps perspective, wouldn't it be amazing to have something like whatever, Microsoft or Copilot or Devin or whatever these kind of next generation development tools are, but what if you had the capability of actually, as that code is being written, have that code being flagged and monitored by a new system that was basically catching all of the bugs and potentially catching all of the security incidences or vulnerabilities as it was actually being done. So I think that that's maybe one way. There are systems out there that are starting to do that, but I think that that's an area of really cool potential use case.
Anik, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think if I kind of go to the issue of data quality and data integration, this is the long pole in the tent. If you look at how much dollars go into that for an AI workflow, 60-70% of the AI workflow is data cleansing. And what's interesting is when you look at that, there's different types of startups that are coming up. One is there's been a lot of focus on cleaning up, getting as much pre-training data as possible. There's a race to get it all. But what's really interesting is a lot of the quality work is being done on the post-training data. So companies like Surge AI or Scale AI, it's all human in the loop. So it's a way to address data quality in a much different way. The second part of it is data integration. I'm going back in the past year a little bit. When you think about all Gen AI is unstructured data. You're talking about video, audio, this is not your structured data. If you look at the IT industry, in the early 2000s, structured data, people had ETL pipelines, data warehouses, all these things. When the cloud, era came, people said, well, how do we do this in the cloud era? Managing structured data, you had Confluence, you had,
Jira.
Yeah, Jira, all these guys came out. And what was kind of interesting is all dealing with structured data. Obviously, when you look at unstructured data, you don't have any front-end ETL pipelines. So how are you going to manage this? And we believe there's going to be a lot of innovation in that layer with using AI to try and solve that, whether you're dealing with multimodal models or different ways to do it. I think the last piece of it, which is interesting from an enterprise perspective, is I think there's going to be AI innovation that we're seeing around LLM model merging, where you can actually work with multiple LLM models in such a way that you don't have to use GPUs, use CPUs, much more cost effective to basically do the data cleansing and do the data processing.
And there will be silicon specifically based on transformer architecture. Trust me, it's coming.
Olivia, your thoughts?
I'll round it out. And one of the things that I want to talk about here as we're looking at AI and specifically generative AI, how do we connect as people, human to human? Well, we connect through communication, whether that's body language, whether that's verbal communication. We're always using some form of communication to connect with each other. The really fascinating thing about generative AI, about these LLMs, about these different interfaces is we're changing, or hopefully for the better, we are adapting how we communicate with each other. So AI is providing these beautiful opportunities for us to be able to break down language barriers, to be able to break down different communication needs barriers. But I want to tell a story real quick, so now we have a little bit more time.
Yeah.
A story real quick, actually, of translators over in Brussels. I spent half of my year over in Brussels, and there's a huge industry there for translation. I'm sure you can understand why. You've got 26 EU member states, and everyone needs to translate everything into all of their different native languages. Now, a firm that was working with these translators said, this is great. We can use generative AI to help with our translations. So they bring it in, and they have the generative AI systems do the first round of translations. So let's say Spanish to Finnish does the first round of translations. And then the translator would come in and edit. What's wrong with this? Sounds like a great use. The problem there was it was the wrong use of automation. It was a fantastic tool, but they automated the thing that the translators found joy in. So a translator is not an editor. A translator actually finds their sense of purpose and joy in that first go at translation. So translating from Spanish to Finnish, someone that works as a translator, they're finding purpose and joy in their work doing that first translation. Then actually taking the generative AI model to then edit the first translation was the good use of that technology. And all of a sudden, these translators began to be more productive with their work rather than be frustrated and sit there going, I'm not an editor. I just feel like I'm checking a machine's work. I've lost the joy of my work. Why am I here? So looking at this, that communication factor, how do we use that communication? How do we use generative AI to enable us to have stronger communication, not automating anything that we can see, but instead looking at where does the support for that communication sit? And then we open up these beautiful opportunities.
And really using it as an way to elevate their sense of purpose versus diminish it over time.
Exactly.
Yeah, no. That's a great uplifting way to end. So I'm just going to pause there because I think it's a great conversation. I think hopefully everyone took away from this kind of the need to be thinking about the human dimension of AI as we're contemplating the technology capability going forward. So thank you all incredibly much. Thank you very much for your contributions through the EAI GG.